All right, everybody, welcome to Oregon State University's Permaculture Design Pro class. This is the winter spring 2023 class, and this is, I believe, our 8th. I don't know. Can somebody check that? Is this our 8th? I think it is. 8th, 9th, 10th. Yes, we have 3 left, including this one. And then we are off to the wilds by ourselves. Just kidding. There's always ways to connect. So today what we're going to do is we're going to chat about a couple of questions. One question has been kind of coming up, and I've been putting off because, as I was just saying before I hit record, a student once showed me years ago this meme of the Incredible Hulk, but he had glasses and it was called the Credible Hulk. He wouldn't like me when I don't source what I know. So I've come to realize that that's a portion of my personality, and we're going to jump into that about documentation and tracking. We also have some questions coming up about metrics, which is a great question, and how to choose metrics. We're going to talk a little bit about cross sections, and then the local biome, which is a great thing to bring up, and then follow up on an AI conversation, which, Sergey, we may put towards the end of the conversation. That may be our last question, so that way if we run long and people want to chat about that, we can. And then Courtney's got a great question here about establishing effective polycultures with mature trees. Yeah, great conversation. Okay, let's jump into, oh, this is embarrassing. I can't show you this browser with like the 300 tabs. I was working on something and it got a little gregarious. You ever do that where tabs start to interact with each other and they start to make babies? Happens all the time. Okay, this is better. Better, but I already talked about it. So really, is it any better? Probably not. Okay, so let's chat a little bit about Colin's question. Moran, documentation and tracking. How do you organize documentation and tracking, compost and watering calendar, plant and animal care guides, harvesting, planning yields, especially working with gardeners that aren't going home to their computers? Do you have any examples or templates that you use? Okay, so as usual, let's talk about first principles and then let's bring it down to the specifics in terms of what we're talking about. So when we take a look at documentation, what's the big why of documentation? Why do we want to document? And one of the things that's really important with documentation is to get a sense of patterns. In permaculture, we're always going from patterns to details, the big scope to the small scope. So patterns give us a sense of what's going on, trends, conversations that are happening over time. And especially if you're working in a group setting or in a setting which has a high turnover of people coming in and out, documentation is key. When I got into growing, I was living at an eco-village, which if you've ever had an experience of living at an eco-village, they aren't necessarily sticklers for documentation or tracking. So every season you'd be picking up the pieces from what was left the season before. And one of the main focuses was to create a tracking process. So we know what was in each bed, what was in the bed the year before from the year afterwards, what generally was yield count, what was planting count. And so at a very early stage in my development, when it comes to things like regenerative design and growing, I came to really appreciate tracking. I'm also slightly OCD and have a large amount of German in me. So generally, I like to be very fastidious with my notes and my conversations and all the rest of it. So we're going to start kind of global and go micro. So first and foremost, when you're talking about tracking, having a system of planting can be really useful. And so things like planting charts that we have here. So this is an example of a planting chart that I used in Canada because it was specific to my zone and area, and it gave me a sense of what to plant where. Generally, I've been starting to develop my own circular calendars, and these are circle calendars that you draw out physically. And generally you have the seasonality and the months, and generally you have rainy seasons and dry seasons, and generally you then have planting dates and things of that nature. I got into biodynamic planting by the biodynamic calendar a couple of years ago. It had always been on my radar, and I had joked for many years I never saw an unprofitable or badly managed biodynamic farm, which was an interesting observation because part of permaculture is observation. What are we observing? And I had never observed a poorly managed biodynamic farm. If you're not familiar with biodynamics, biodynamics was created by and inspired by Rudolf Steiner, who in a very short, pithy conversation basically believes that everything grows because of the cosmic energy that's gathered from the universe and from the cycles that are inferred because of it. And so if you work with those cosmic cycles, you generally have higher yields. And then there's a whole fertility regime and a lot of other pieces to it. I never got into the fertility piece. I never got into the packing of the cow horns and things of that nature. But I tried out the planting schedule. And I'll take a look. I think it was Earth Haven Farm. Yeah, Earth Haven, if you're in North America, is a great place to pick up the planting calendar. And I started planting by planting calendar. And that then led me to dividing up all my seeds. So this is my seed library. I divided it into fruits, beans and peas, leaves, flowers, medicinal, basically all of the different categories. So that way I knew what I was planting when. And one of the great things about planting from a system is it takes a lot of the thinking out of it. And the more you can take the thinking out of, not the thinking, what am I trying to say? The more you take the deliberating out of a planting process, usually the more successful it can be. So basically I would go to my calendar, I would see if it was a leaf day or if it was a fruit day or if it was a root day. And that's what I would plant, be it direct seeding or starting seedlings out and then transplanting, and when that happened. Further to this, a colleague of mine who's Swiss German, I reached out to him one day, and he manages a forest and woodlot on Salt Spring Island in British Columbia, Canada. And I said, Michael, is there actually anything to this whole planting by the moon when it comes to the sap flow? And sure enough, the Germans had just reams of studies about this. And so that was during the advent of Google Translate a couple of years back, and I ended up reading the translated version of the study. And yes, indeed, planting and harvesting and all the rest of it, working with lunar cycles, has a huge impact. So I became a proponent and really enjoy planting from this schedule because it's simple. You basically just follow it along. And generally, this was my workstation. Colin, this was the book that I don't have here, but I was looking for photos of, because this was my whole plant seeding guide. This was done on a easy write in the rain booklet that I could write with pencil or pen, and it would never smear or smudge. And this is what I ended up working with. For those that are interested, this is what's called soil blocking. These are the smallest soil blocks. And so if you're worried about the germination of your seed, you can get a lot of seeds in a small amount of place. There's also a lot of different seeding guides, which we can chat about another time. I'm going to label some of these so we're not totally being crazy. Let's see if I can get it's the problem with putting images in here. Sometimes you can't get I'll put it above then. So this is from Profitable Urban Farming. This is Curtis Stone's approach. Good buddy of mine for a number of years. We've known each other now going on, I think it's close to 14 years. And I actually helped him named his process. So when I was working for a homestead conversation, and this comes up because of your second question, Colin, in terms of profitability, and you're not just growing for yourself, but growing for friends. I wanted a system, again, that I didn't have to think about. And so between Curtis's process and between Jean-Martin Fortier, I think that's right. And what is his, it's called The Market Garden. So both of these are books. Curtis actually has a course about this. Both of these are books. And basically this type of data conversation is really useful. So understanding the unit type, is it a bunch or a pound, the price, the pound, the price per pound, the dollar for feet per day, which is a really interesting column. The plates used, the row sizes, grams per seed, seeds, volume, plant state, average date to maturity, DTM, was something that I actively used in my work just to understand when it was coming to maturity and when I had to transplant and when I could get a yield from it. And if you're working on a commercial scale in a farm, DTM is important because of crop rotation. So that way you've got whatever the next crop is going in afterwards. Average yield per bed and average yield of pound. And one of the things I took off of Curtis's approach, which was based upon Spin's approach, small plot intensive farming, that was created by two people in Paul and Westmoreland out of Philadelphia, and then a gentleman out of Saskatchewan, is they wanted to classify how much food you could create in front yards, backyards, all the rest of it. Is this permaculture? No. Is this production farming? Yes. Can the two meet? Yes, but not without sacrificing either the ecology on one side or the profitability and production on the other side. So the right tool for the right job is what I would suggest, and being conscientious about that. Jean-Martin is probably a little bit more towards the ecological. And so this was a great, one of his 10-year crop rotations, just showing where the crops move and how the crops move forward. This is from his book, which I highly recommend. Typical annual sales, and again, profitability per bed and what they're growing and why. Record sheet. So this is definitely closer to what I was putting into that little notebook. So date and cultivar, cell size and number, date and transplanting location, date of first harvest, yield for a 100-foot bed. The one thing I added in here, Colin, that I really appreciated was the seed location. And for me, who was always processing and practicing and looking at different things, that was super useful to understand what's the germination rate. That was the other thing I had in there, was germ rate. So if I put in 100 seeds and 90 came up, it was a 90% germ rate. I wanted to know what suppliers and generally what seed had a higher germination rate. You can, of course, skip all of that by just buying from seed companies that have a good reputation. It usually means that they're only putting out high quality seed. And then, so this is from a course that a colleague of mine and I, Kakasima Esquith, a Métis woman in northwestern Alberta, put together. And this was our response to raising food prices. We put together this amazing course called Family Food Security. And Kakasimu is an incredible human. She's got the drive and the intelligence, and she also has the ancestral connection. And I reached out to her early on in Regenerative Living's inception and basically said, listen, do you want to create a family food security course? And she already had all of this. She built this out. Now, this is proprietary to her and the course. So if you want the spreadsheets, you can always sign up for the course, which I think is an incredible value. You go to regenerativeliving.online and it's family food security self-paced. But basically, this is for a homesteading conversation. This is the vegetables, the months you eat it per year, the times per week you eat it, and the amount that you eat per time. And that then produces the total pounds per year you need, the total pounds per foot in terms of garden beds you need, the linear foot space, the bed foot space, the seed per foot. It's just incredible. Seeds needed. Forget what that one is. Let's jump in a little bit tighter. Oh, right. You go in tight and it gets further out. I don't know if it's actually going to make it easier. Not really. Percentage, right? So the other aspect of this was like, were you going to grow it? Were you going to dry it? Were you going to can it? What was the storage like? And so she produced these for everything. She produced this for fruit. She produced this for protein. It's such an incredible way of approaching it. So generally, Colin, what I would say is you generally want to know each stage of the production of what it is you're growing. And at each stage, whatever the determinable or the variable metrics are, how long does it take to come to maturity? How much space does it take up? How much water does it take up? Generally, is it a heavy feeder or a light feeder? All of these aspects will then give you the opportunity and the capability to be able to put together. What I ended up doing was working on paper, only because I like working on paper a lot more than I like working and sitting at the computer. But generally, when you're working at a farm level, you usually have an outdoor data station. So you usually have a covered over area that you can then go and work at. And you can make all the data points. And usually you do those data points as soon as you're done a task or a process, which is one of the reasons why I carried around my little book. I'm going to go back to a fit because it's getting a little wonky. Oh, it doesn't want to go back anymore. There we go. Which is why I ended up going to my little book, because I had it on me all the time and it fit in my little yogurt container of planting seeds and popsicle sticks and all those good things. So I generally kept that all together. For compost, there's kind of just a few things you want to know, things like date, time. So what's the date? What's the time? What's the color? So what's the color of the compost? Smell, temperature with a compost thermometer, moisture, which you use by hand field. Generally, compost should never yield any more than a drop or two of water when you squeeze it, and it should usually feel like moist cake. If you work with a microscope, there might be a microscopy test, so you might be taking in a quantitative or a qualitative assay of that. And then usually you're taking images of it. And the other things that I forgot to put on here, which are useful, is the climate currently. So is it rainy? What has been the rain in the last 24 hours? This is if your compost isn't covered. So it all depends on how you're, as we were talking about last time, it all depends on how you're making that compost. In terms of watering, because you made that point, watering is an interesting one. So generally what I'm doing is I'm going for what's called field capacity, which we've talked about before. There's two stages of water. We talk about field capacity and saturation. Field capacity is when all of the little soil molecules called PEDs, P-E-D, all those PEDs still have water around them. So the capillary action of adhesion and cohesion has water around the PED, but there's still what's called interstitial airspace. There's still air in between the PEDs, so that way the soil organisms, which are terrestrial, are still able to breathe and respire and do all the things they need to do. Once we move past that into saturation, that's when we have problems, because once a soil is saturated, it can be problematic for the plants that are there. So on the other hand, in terms of soil parent material, we have sand, silt, and clay. Of course, sand has the hardest time getting to saturation because it's so free draining. Clay has the easiest. So when you're taking a look at watering schedules and tables, it's really about being conscientious of how much water you're giving it, how much time you let that watering go, and then going and checking the moisture. So if it looks like or feels like there's pooling, you've gotten to saturation. So usually I would then dial back my watering by 25 or 45 or 25 or 50%, always working in quarters because it's easier to do the math. And then seeing at what point do we get to saturation and then pulling back from that. And then that's usually the duration of what I'm using for that plot. Then you have to think about, well, what are we going for in terms of our growing? If this is a breeding bed where we're breeding plants that we want to be, let's say, dry farmed, we're going to try and give it the least amount of water possible to have the most amount of growth. If we're doing something like production farming, like the market gardener or profitable urban farming, we have a pretty standard set conversation where we're usually watering in the morning and usually watering at night, and we're leaving the middle of the day because it's high and dry unless we get a heat wave and then we're watering. So one way is to be very conscientious about how much water you put in, and then scheduling your water appropriately, and then either having a schedule that you're referring to people manually, or you're putting up on the big board by your processing station that says these are the watering times, has it been completed, and then having people detail that. Or you're working with timers. Generally, over the last couple of years, I've worked with timers exclusively, because watering takes a lot of time. And so we were watering like every other day, morning, and then evening, and then morning, because I was trying to not only produce food, but I was trying to produce a viable seed that would then be dryland farmed. So it would require less water every single year. So epigenetics are really important. The idea that what happens in the growing cycle of a plant then produces that intelligence through DNA off to its offspring. And one of my favorite examples of this is in Holland and the Netherlands during the Second World War. They were so lacking in calories that the next generation of their children were, I think, like upwards of 60 to 80% diabetic, because they had learned how to rely on such little calories. They'd passed that on to their children. Their children went back to a regular diet, and the response was diabetic, or was diabetes. So generally, that's the process I work with, is generally understanding, what are the variables, what are the elements that I'm trying to control for, and then monitoring those. And then again, all of these spreadsheets, you can then put into grid paper, and then just either if you're working with grid paper that isn't waterproof, having in a plastic sheet and making sure that's always under cover, or working with something that isn't, and then having it out in the field. Any follow-up questions to that, Colin, or anybody else who's curious about documentation?
Thank you. This is amazing. I think this all makes sense, and getting that as a project in itself, but then getting and making sure that everybody's following the calendar that seems to be another task. So how do you get that into a readable format that you can then reference and sort and organize? It just seems daunting.
Yeah, so usually a book for each. So usually you've got your production guide, usually you've got your watering guide. And then basically it's just a practice of here's what's necessary during the day, here's what needs to be done. And then usually the way to get people to have adherence is to have celebration. And so in the garden, when I was part of the garden team, the end of the day, debrief during the day was clean the tools, put the tools away, clean, sharpen, put the tools away. And then we'd all meet for 5 or 10 minutes and we would go over the data. So, okay, Susan did a great job. She totally nailed this. Somebody else would look at it and then they would comment on what they liked or what they thought could be improved. And we would all go through this process for each one of our jobs. That was usually during the beginning of the season. And then that relaxed kind of every other day. And then that relaxed every week during the height of season. So it was one of those things that we ramped up to the season and then usually forgot about for a couple of weeks during like everything has to get out of the ground. But then me usually would be like, are we weighing produce? And everyone was like, yeah, of course we are. There was like 2 cases. This case weighed this much. Can we say it's the same? So there's always going to be variable. It's people. But I can tell you that the more you adhere to the documentation, the weighing, the processing, the better off your metrics will be and the more reliable that data is for then planning for the next year and the next season. And if you're in a place where seeds are cost prohibitive or let's say this, if any of the necessary elements to make a successful farm or growing area are prohibitive, either in accessibility or cost, this is a lifesaver. This basically tells you, yeah, we don't have to buy the extra package of seed or the extra sack of fertilizer or the extra whatever. We don't need those things because we have this conversation here. So generally, I find that having everything large and in charge, so having large whiteboards, large chalkboards that people can go to, having somebody on the team that it's their job to then go and transfer that into a long-term storage. So either that's paper or everything in paper throughout the week then gets data entered into a cloud or a double and separated. So this was something I picked up in wilderness first aid training. Anything that was important enough to document was important enough to separate. So usually having one documentation and then having it duplicated and then having it separated. The cool thing about the cloud is that if you work on something like Google, you know it has redundancy built in. And then usually I would do a hard drive backup once a month. So just depends on what you're working with. But basically, if you celebrate people and give them opportunity to get accolades from doing documentation, it increases their amount of engagement and adherence.
I have a friend who runs a semi-organic farm locally, and he recommended an app called Light Farm from the University of British Columbia.
Cool.
And it's used worldwide. It's really cool. I haven't used it much, but it's litefarm.org, and it works best on Google. So it's planning all in one place. It's designed for sustainable farmers. And you can add tasks, crop rotations, like all of it. So it's open source software. And it's really like the UI is great from my designer's perspective. And it seems really functional and a little bit customizable too. So if you guys want to check that out, it might be useful.
Oh, cool. Thanks so much. Appreciate that. Fantastic. Any follow-up questions?
I have a follow-up question about taking it away from like a farm level to, landscape design level, where you build a landscape for a customer and plant annuals, almost with perennials, trees, shrubs, pollinator garden. Do you follow somewhat similar process in documenting the installation, the watering, and everything else?
Yeah, so usually with large scale or small scale landscape design, I then move to what's called bill of quantities. And so bill of quantities is usually within the scope of the final design, which gives how many plants, how many row feet, all of those pieces. If it's a landscape that is edible but not production focused, I don't. So it's basically, we want 2 fruit trees. Here's your 2 fruit trees. If it's a client, and more of my clients are like this, they want the back end. They want to know like how much fruit do we need for X. Then I will do that. And usually the spreadsheets and what I'm using is the family food calculators because they're really good. If folks are then looking for a manual on how to operate their landscape, usually what I recommend is that I come back once a season and I update the manual and I take metrics, or I teach them how to take metrics, so that way I can update the manual in terms of the operating manual, what to put in when, what then to follow it up with if there's an annual component. If there's a perennial component, I usually put together a guide in terms of, you have plums, you have blueberries, blackberries, haskaps. Generally, this is the window when they flower. Generally, this is the window when they fruit. Generally, this is the window when you can harvest. Here's the end date for those pieces. And generally, here's pruning instructions. So one of the things that clients really like about my work is that I can be as comprehensive or as slimmed as they want, because I have that ability. Handing somebody a manual, though, needs updating because it's a living system. And so one of the caveats in the manuals are always, this is true for this date and time and this point in succession of your landscape. As your landscape becomes more mature, you're going to find that variables will change in terms of harvest amounts, timing, phenology, things of that nature. So it just depends on what the client's looking for if they want that level of conversation. Some clients, especially the homesteaders, they want to know what plants are best and how do we cultivate them. And this is partially why I've been developing regenerativeliving.online, is because I would really like to not have to spend 4 or 5 days teaching somebody propagation and instead bring in somebody like Peter Janes, whose course starts tomorrow, May 2nd, about how to propagate, how to make more babies. So for landscaping, it's usually either bill of quantities if it's just a design and hand over, or if folks are looking for production schedules, then I'll make them a production schedule, generally what they can expect throughout the life of it. It's a great question, Sergey. Cool. Let's mosey on to question 2, farm production metrics. What metrics do you use to evaluate farm operations, especially for a growing farm? We're in the transition between small scale growing for ourselves and being able to give to friends and family and to sell to the parents at our farm's educational center. We also are part of a larger farm that still uses tilling and other non-regenerative techniques. We have the opportunity to present the larger farm a plan to move to regenerative methods, influence better management, and track production and yield. How would you approach proposing a plan and metrics to an old school farm like this? I've been part of these conversations. They seldom go well unless you have a champion within the old school farm. So it's always about, when you're trying to move people off of existing patterns and beliefs, which they almost never do, it's always about finding what's called a departure point of dialogue. And this comes from interfaith conversations. So when like the old man and the priest and the father all meet, there's so much disparity between their cognitive, intellectual, conceptual frameworks. What's the departure point of dialogue? And usually it's motivation. Usually it's why. So the big conversation I would have is, what is the why of the old school farm, or who you're trying to present to? Like, what's their big why? Is it production? Is it longevity? Is it, what is it? And the thing that is not always, but sometimes, most times, a benefit of regenerative practices is intercropping, is basically having a multitude of crops that are always cropping at some point, and integration of perennials. Because monocrop is all about the one thing that is placed in that takes the same nutrition as the other thing. Like what's the most competitive thing to corn? Corn, because it takes the exact same nutritional conversation, which is why in permaculture and regenerative land design, we not only take a look at story stacking above the food forest conversation, 7 stories, inhabiting different places of solar real estate, we're also doing that below ground, and we're trying to understand what's the root depth of all of these different elements, because generally at different depths, you're going to have different demands. And if there's only one thing at that depth, then you're not having competition. So that conversation of, well, if your rye crop fails, we have 7 crops growing in the same place. And yes, not one of those crops will produce the same amount as your one crop of rye, but it's a dependable conversation because we always have something that's producing. So that's one of the more persuasive arguments, is that there's always, you've got some hedging, right? So in a dry year, you've got your dry crops that are producing, and your wet year, you have your wet crops, and you also have annuals and perennials. And the way I always do it, and you'll have to change it for your own financial common knowledge, is I look at, like Curtis Stone's, the intensive farming conversation as the ATM. Seeds go in, food comes out. Seed goes in, food goes out. Does it produce and does it create more of its own fertility? No, it's totally extractive. Does that mean then you have to then put in cover cropping and potentially a little bit of additive? Absolutely. And so that's where you kind of have that ATM conversation: money in, money out, money in, money out. And again, it won't work for every situation. May not in Buran. I don't think, I don't know. I don't know if ATM cards are a thing there. Then you get into sort of your checking accounts, your saving accounts, you get into your field crops, you get into your longer crops. And then you get into your perennial plants, and then you get into your trees, your long-term investments, your 401ks, your RRSPs. And that conversation, I think, can make a lot of sense to farms when you're saying, we want to take a portion of this farm and we want to transfer it over, or we want to take a hedgerow and we want to transfer it over, or we want to start to work in composting and we want to take it over. At that point, you can work in what we would call ecological metrics. But here's the thing: a lot of these farms don't care about ecological metrics at all. They don't care about biodiversity. They don't care about bird count. They don't care about earthworm count. They don't care about total wetness indicator, which you can take from a moisture probe. They're just like, how much fruit are we pulling off of this? Now, generally, or organic or regenerative practices farm can get up to a production level farm's production in terms of total yield at about 85%, like 80 to 85%. It's never going to totally outperform a single crop. Again, its strength is that holistic nature, that conversation that brings it all together, plus the fact that it's very resilient. Regenerative farms, permaculture farms tend not to be affected by prolonged drought because they've worked on the soil structure. So as I'm saying this, hopefully metrics are starting to form in your mind, like soil structure, like soil analysis, like earthworm count, like total percentage of ground that is covered with either living plants or dead plants. You know, all of these pieces are metrics that we can take, including things like carbon analysis, if you have that available. If, again, 1% of carbon per acre increases the amount of water holding capacity by 20,000 gallons. So all of those are metrics I would use if I was developing something, and I would test them regularly to show that conversation moving in the right direction, as well as microscopy or fungal to bacterial ratio. I would use that as well. The other thing I would work in is, what is the enjoyment of people being on the farm? Does it have a high retention rate? Do people like coming to work? Is it easy to get people to come to work? Is it easy for people to work on this? This is where I think we can borrow from the building world and some of their standards, things like the LEED standard, which was pretty much outdated by the time it was in. But then we have what's called the Living Building Challenge, which had an aspect of what is the beauty of this place, and is this place desired to be within? So I think those are non-motivational metrics for old school, traditional, well, let's call it conventional farming practices. But that's sort of that abiotic side. The other piece is how many insects are we seeing? Are we seeing an increase in animal pressure? Usually an increase in animal pressure is a good thing that we have to manage, but it's usually a good thing because it's a more desirable place to be in. Then you can take a look at metrics. So I like when I'm doing a side comparison of A to B, showing everything. So showing how much production did we have? What was the pound per acre per yield? How much did that produce in terms of finances? When did that produce? So this is the other thing about monocropping farm. You're usually getting 2 or 3, depending on your climate, crops per year out of that same space. Within regenerative practices or farming practices, you can get upwards of 20 or 30 in that same space because you're stacking in space and you're stacking in time. So generally, if you can take the metrics and if you can work with them, and that's another piece about going back to how can you get people to make sure those metrics are taken in, having that sense of, if we document this well, we might be able to take on more of the farm and convert this over. That can also be motivational for people in terms of their metrics. There's probably like another 40 I'm missing, but that's just what comes to mind. And I'll pass this over to a colleague of mine who works in a lot more of the science-based conversation, and she'll have metrics from a scientific perspective that I think will be interesting. Any follow-up questions to that?
I don't think so. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Also, question for everybody here. Was it somebody in this class that asked me about Robinia and its toxicity under leaf fall? I don't know if it was this class or the other class, but I do have an answer for that now. So if it's not anybody who's live here, if it's somebody who's watching this later, reach out, because yeah, I feel like it might have been Sergey asking about Norway Maple.
Yeah, Norway Maple was me.
Okay, awesome. Let's answer that. Let's answer that question, because that was a good one. And I'll bring up Susan Cousineau. So this is my pitch for Susan Cousineau and the farm ecologist. I'm just going to grab her website and I'm going to put it onto our. She's also an instructor in this course. We were almost going to do a course about science-based production, but the world happened. So I'm going to put it right here, the farm ecologist, and I'm just going to quickly pop in the question and the answer. Sergey, I'm glad you were on, because I wanted to make sure that we captured this. So I'm just going to bring this over. Oh wow! I just saw our production coming in from the garden. My husband just had this monstrous head of lettuce and chirimoya, and okay, now I'm salivating. Let's focus. I'll focus on food. I threw out my back last Thursday, and today's one of the first days that I'm feeling good. So if I'm a little up and at it, that's why. Okay, so let's talk about Norway Maple, because that was a good question, and I kind of want to tie all these things together. Okay, so Sergey's question, I think I don't know where it came from, but it came to me. Found it hard to find authoritative info on toxicity of Norway Maple root releases. All I see is it may release. Also couldn't find info whether the toxicity releases continues after the tree is cut down. From experience, the stump tries to sprout new seedlings for a year or two, but gives up if seedlings are cut down. Do you have any insights regarding this? And here's what Susan found. Again, pharmacologist. We can make sure that this is well cited. Here's what I found in a nutshell. There's evidence for relatively weak allelopathy from Acer plananoides, both from study planted among natives and planting into soils which the trees were growing, and extracts were weak but significant effects. But in generalized plant databases like invasives.org, there is no scientific evidence, so clearly they need some updating. It seems like the soil effects are one point and strong canopy shading crowding impacts are another. One paper recommends pulling the seedlings every 2 to 3 years to keep both in check. So there you go, Sergey. That was her answer. And then I'll just point over here. She has a lot of great resources. This was a great webinar we did about building your scientific pause button, about when you should hit the pause button on what you know and are creating. And the other thing, I don't know if she has it on here. Yeah, she has an amazing compendium of regenerative agriculture scientific studies. She's creating this amazing database, which has a small fee for access, but the right person for the right job. So yeah, there we go.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. And coming off your question and going right into your question. So how to choose a cross-section to extract maximum value for the design process. Okay. So I said what we were going to do and talk a little bit about cross-sections in general. And I talk about it in the tutorials, but there can be a lot of value in the way that they are created. So what is going on here? There we go. And just a big thanks to everybody who said yes to be part of the examples. That's really incredible. So I just want to see if there was any good cross sections that I had. Detailed zone one. Kind of go to the same ones all the time. So I just want to see if there's a better idea here. There's a gentleman from Korea last year. I don't know if he said yes. No, I don't think he did. Okay. So instead, I'm just going to go to Audria. Let's pull up hers. And just a nice reminder here, we've got this amazing list, which eventually will be a searchable database. It's one of the projects I'm working on right now. And I just want to make sure I've got the question right. Cross-section, extract maximum value. Right. Okay. So I'll go down to her cross-section. So one of the tools we have at our disposal is cross-sections. And cross-sections are basically taking a slice of the site, just like a slice of cake, and then pulling aside the cake and then seeing that top section of the cake and everything that's on top of it, potentially below it. I've had students before that have taken their soil analysis and have put those elements below as well. But one of the things that we want to take a look at for cross-sections is usually any area that has a major change of elevation difference, just to see the difference and how it's stepping down. And the other could be a shading factor. So this is one of the reasons why I suggest people put in their solar aspects into a north-south conversation here. So B is north here and A is south. So generally when we're working with this, I'm just going to pull my toolbox over. Generally, when we're working with this, it's a great idea to bring in our, sorry, sun is not purple. And if it is, it's a big problem. So generally, we're bringing in our solar aspect, and our solar aspect is usually going at the top of the trees, just to show what shading looks like in the summer and what shading looks like in the winter. So this can be a useful aspect in terms of why we decide where to go, because we want to get a sense of what our shading component will be like. And whenever I'm doing a production design, I'll do due diligence on my shading. And this includes ensuring that they might be offset in terms of our planting, but also what is our shading component. So I'm choosing correctly in terms of the shade variable in that. The other element, trying to think if there's a good one that comes to mind. But in this case, because she did end up going in and she ended up, I think she did a cross section for her plant design that showed the different steps that she was taking. Might have been in the final. Maybe not. Is you can then go in and you can, punch in here, you can then design in what the swales are going to look like and generally get a sense of what that sizing and scope will be. So let's say we wanted to put something down here, we could then do our A to B. So A has to equal B. So this is of course a little bit low. So we'd probably make sure that we could get a good sense of what that sizing would look like. That's roughly A to B. So A is the borrow pit and B is the mound, just to get a sense of what this might look like. So this can be very useful as well, especially if we're working with ponds or step ponds and we want to get a sense of that water flow and that head height, all of those pieces. The other thing I find for clients, and this was true for students as well, especially during this class and previous classes, is when people are starting to do their cross sections, they start to see their site in a better way in place. So I know with these clients I'm working with in the Pacific Northwest, I'll probably do a cross section just to show them how their house looks in terms of where their compost looks, in terms of where their animals are. So one of the interesting things with the cross section, especially if we're saying that the needs of one element are going to be the potential for another, is with that elevational conversation, you can show what influences the next element to the next element to the next element. So those are generally the reasons why I'm using cross sections. And if I'm doing a cross section that is east to west, I'll put the, I wonder if I can roll this over. Yeah. I'll put that solar aspect on both sides just to get a sense of what that shading looks like in the summer morning and the summer evening. just so I can get a sense of what that looks like, so I know what that shading component is. But generally, that's what I'm looking at in terms of cross-section. There's definitely a couple more pieces when it comes to putting in buildings and the shading aspect of buildings. So one of the most important things when you're looking at a building is to make sure, and I'm pretty sure I say this in the tutorial, is I really want to make sure that the eaves of my buildings, if they were new buildings, cover that hot summer sun. You can remove almost the majority of the issues here. So let's take a look at this. So right now, the lower half of this building is being hit by the summer sun with this totally made up angle I just had. So, you know, playing with that angle just to make sure that the eaves are long enough so that way you don't have solar input onto the walls to further heat up the walls is really important when you get into passive solar design and different elements like that. And this can also be true if you want to extend and put on a deck or a patio or a sunroom or anything like that on the house. This is a great question. Any follow-up questions to that, Sergey, or anybody else?
Would you also, on that roof line, consider solar panels to generate electricity?
Yeah, so
hit that sun.
In terms of our solar conversation, I highly recommend if you're ever looking at getting solar in-house, go get 3 of the local companies to come up and give you a quote and then pick their brains. You're going to learn more about solar in that time than you ever do reading a book or being in a course. But generally, if we're looking at solar arrays, generally we're not going to worry too much about solar angles from this perspective. Generally, they're going to set them at a specific pitch depending on your latitude, and generally they're going to pitch them south. So if it's a ground-mounted array or if it's a house-mounted array, they'll generally either take the pitch of the roof or they'll have their own mounting system that pitches them at a certain angle. I think where I was at, it was something like 35% or something like that. I don't quite remember. It's one of those things that, like Einstein said, if you can look it up, you don't have to remember it, keep it in your mind. But basically, the systems that track the sun, the systems that you go out and you move the panels, generally the potential for damage or the effort required or the friction produced because you then have to go out and do this thing never comes out in the wash because it just takes so much to go and do it. So you might have seen these panels that track with the sun. Yeah, they get like 5 to 10% more, but the wear on the materials, the fact that it takes electricity, the fact that it moves, generally at this point in time, until we get either a lighter panel or a cheaper panel, it just doesn't make any sense. So yeah, that's my approach to solar. When I started in permaculture, I became very knowledgeable about solar and then realized doesn't matter what I do. We're going to call in the solar company. They're going to come in and they're going to do the work. So yeah, I stepped way back from that conversation because it wasn't necessary. That being said, things like solar dehydrators, solar evacuated hot water heating, things like that. One of the designs that I really enjoy, created by actually the instructor of the rainwater harvesting course, Gord Baird. And you know what? I'm going to stop my share and see if I can't find it because it's a great design. Solar dehydrator. So I've got, of course, 3 folders, which will make this a little bit. Of course, it's the first one. Fantastic. There we go. Oh, so we're just gonna download that quickly. Make available offline. Over here, open these up. Okay, or we'll put it over here. No matter. So this is an amazing design created by Gord Baird of EcoSense, eco-sense.ca. And the brilliance of this design is that it is on a pole. You can see it here. Basically, there's an inset here, and there's a pole. And so basically, Gord can turn this to the sun and get the maximum potential in the same way you do with a solar cooker. He uses stainless steel grating, because one of the major issues with solar dehydrating is the mesh material that you're using and that transferring into the food. There it is on the back. And this one in particular has this big open air conversation that basically has the ability to take air in from the bottom, which is meshed, heats up here. There's a little miniature milliamp fan, computer fan here with a little tiny solar panel on top. And then it shunts the air down through here, comes up, and then there's a little vent here on the back door. You can see, let's see if there's a better photo, kind of. You can see the holes that are punched in here in a mesh. So basically, the way this works is, let's see if we can find a good photo to do a drawing. Yeah, here we go. So basically our air, which we will make blue, ever decides, there we go, comes in here. Oh, you know what? There's an arrow tool on this, I remember now. Make it thin. So the air comes in here. It heats up and comes up this way. It then is sucked down through this pipe, comes in here, and then we're going to switch our angle. And then that warm air that we were talking about, go back to our arrow. That warm air is coming down here and then is naturally rising up here and then is exiting out this top area. And this is one of my favorite solar dehydrator designs. There's 101 designs, but what I really like about this is that you can turn it to the sun. The majority of the ones that I've worked with and used are usually on a little dolly. They have 2 wheels and you have to roll them around. And if you dehydrate tomatoes, if you dehydrate fruit, it can be very heavy. Because this is just on a post and an inset with a little bit of grease on it, it's super easy. It slips back and forth. So there you go, Phyllis. Not the question you asked, but the question I responded with, and hopefully that's useful. I really do like those designs, and I know Gord has them for sale, pretty cheap. I think it's like $10 on his website, eco-sense.ca. All right, back to another Sergey question. Right. So Sergey had this point, and what's funny is that there's changes to the materials and the conversation in the OSU PDC, and one of them was that the local ecology survey was too big. And basically, my boss came back to me and was like, "You're asking them to do too much." And you'll see, and Sergey pointed it out in the tutorial. There's this whole conversation about local biome, which had been removed as a section within that assignment. It was removed by somebody else. We won't say who. Yeah, I do agree that it's one of the most rewarding parts of like understanding that local ecology, because once you have a sense of that biome, you have that whole conversation beneath it in terms of the flora and fauna and what's there and those distinct biomes. And you can really start to see your site in a more objective way, a more qualitative way. You can see the changes as it moves from one to another. So yeah, I really appreciate you bringing that up. Was there anything else you wanted to say about that, sir?
No, this was just in my review, you asked me what I was referring to.
Yeah.
So it was not very clear. So I just wanted to make it clear. And then if anybody else wants to do it on their own time, I highly recommend it.
Good deal. Thank you, sir. Awesome. We're going to switch. We're going to skip the AI conversation, and I can stay a little bit later, not like the hour extra later that we did the last time, but happy to have a conversation. So we're going to go to Courtney's conversation, which is curious on best ways to establish effective polycultures with mature trees, crab, maple, oak already in place, especially with grass, weed, undergrowth. Cool. So Courtney, I'm going to make a couple assumptions, and if any of these assumptions are wrong, just chime in and recorrect me. So we're going to treat our green tree as our existing, and we're going to treat our dark green trees or dark green vegetative symbols as being established. So if we're working in, and I'm going to make sure that I do this in plan and then in cross section, which means I got to move. Which means I got to move my face box over here. There we go. Back to this and back to this color. Great. Back to this color. This one. So if this is our plan, and let's call this our, that's about the same size. We'll make it a bit more oval. And this is our cross section. So generally, let's talk about some general conversations. Generally, if we're planting under trees, generally we want to be on that second story, we want to be at drip edge. And we can either be 50-50 drip edge, so we can have a 50-50 like this. And so what this will look like over here, something like this. And something like this as I get to the edge of my screen. Or we'll be just touching drip edge. So something more like this. So in terms of placement, this is usually what I'll be working with in terms of story. So if we're going 1 story and 2 story and 3 story and whatnot. And then basically that pattern can repeat as we move lower down. We can then kind of work within drip edges here as well. Now, I've said this before, I'll say it again. Always make sure you can come in and you can access these areas. So if we're having these areas, we want to be able to then have access, and access is normally orange or brown, usually a thicker one. So basically we want to be able to come in and come around these areas and be able to walk them and be able to actively harvest them. One of the major mistakes as you guys are going to be getting into design is that new designers will crowd out this understory, so that way there's no space to ever get in, harvest, or facilitate. This is even okay because there's space underneath. So let's say we had a couple of more bushes under here, you could still get in and access it. But generally, more space is going to give more space to come in and look at things. Generally, if things get jungle-like and too crowded, the literacy goes down and your brain kind of has a fried wire moment, and it's problematic to get in even mentally. But generally from the sense of you've got to bring in a wheelbarrow, you've got to facilitate this area. So you're coming in to work on this. You want to be able to come in and facilitate this conversation. The second reason why we usually go to drip edge is because the root zone is usually going to the drip edge as well. So usually when we're coming into this conversation, we've got our roots that are coming out to this drip edge. And so if we do dig in at drip edge, chances are we're going to see, the end of some of those feeder roots, because they don't perfectly stop at the drip edge. Sometimes they're a little bit longer, a little shorter. So if we do decide to dig in on this area down here, we're going to expect to see a couple of roots, and we don't want to disrupt those as much as possible. In terms of understory material and starting to think about establishment, generally mulching or generally tarping under a tree, if we are going to then reestablish the understory, can be a really effective way of coming at this. So a couple of simple tarps around, either working with the silage tarps we've talked about before, or I've used lumber wrapper as well. So these are the black on one side, white on the other, free to anybody who comes up to a lumber yard and asks to go through their garbage. You can usually find them. The problem with them is that they're woven. They tend to degrade in photo light, in UV light. They're photosensitive, and they're a pain to get rid of afterwards. So I'd rather buy something that's heavy duty, 8 mil, 6 mil silage tarpage, cut it, and then just use it for 10, 15 years. In terms of establishment, working with holes, you can either work with prepping the hole kind of like a hugelkultur or lasagna garden inside the hole a year or two in advance. And that really peppers the hole with quite a bit of fertility. So basically layering with the materials you would use in lasagna gardening. So your greens, your browns, your fertiles, all of that in there, and then letting it decompose. Knowing that usually any pile you make that's set to decompose will lose 40% of its height, its width, its volume. So generally think about mounding up high and letting it decompose. We did this a while back using fish heads and guts and things, and it was terrible to replant into, but man, was it potent once the tree got established and got over transplant shock. Talking about transplant shock, so one of the ways to reduce transplant shock in terms of establishment is to make sure that the root balls are always wet, that they go in wet. A little bit of a dip of a mycorrhizal product is great. And so Mike, M-Y-K-E, was the one that I used when I was doing a lot of installs. You could also do aerated compost extracts, which was something that worked really well for us. And then any sort of fertilizers you want to put in there, either the, the fish head approach or like what you have on hand versus, your bought materials. Up in Canada, we had a great fertility company called Gaia Green. And you could look that up and take a look at generally their process and their product, and either find something suitable locally if you want to do a bought product or not. Generally with trees, we want to try to not stake them because they can become quite dependent upon the stake. But if we are, we'll usually just stake something with a very thin stake and then a very thin wire that can just keep it up for maybe year 1 or year 2, and then we want to let that go. And generally, if the tree has grown into the wire, we just cut the wire and we let it be, because of the way that trees heal, the coated system, COIT, they heal in 8 different variables, and so they'll usually heal over something and it'll be totally healed and non-problematic. And then in terms of, go ahead.
When you talk about staking, I'm looking at this beautiful crabapple that is in our backyard, and it's probably about 20 feet tall, and its blooms just fell off because we had a bunch of rain. But whoever planted it, it's right near our wellhead, and the soil is still kind of poor, and it is staked and has been since we moved in, and I imagine probably most of its life.
Yep.
And it's not just like, I mean, it is there, like that's some heavy duty staking that it's experiencing, and it's struggled obviously its whole life to live because of the conditions it's under. So part of this is trying to figure out how I can best help this poor tree that offers so much to pollinators and birds and stuff.
Yeah. So usually if a tree has gone past, its basal years, it's 2, 3, 4 years, and it's still staked, it's usually become dependent on the staking, and you're not going to be able to remove the stake without damaging the structure of the tree, because the tree has generally taken that stake in as part of what it's growing against. So that'll be problematic, I think, generally. If you're trying to help it out, things like aerated compost extract or an inch of good compost after you pull out mulch, if there's mulch there, and putting it around the base up until the canopy, the drip line, and making sure it's away from the trunk itself, and then putting the mulch back on top. That usually during the spring or the fall is one of the best ways to help a tree out, is just to give it a little bit more food in its feeding root area. Does it seem like it's been unduly pruned, or does it seem like there's a lot of disease and dying branches in it?
Dying branches. Yeah.
So generally I would go in and I would remove those. Those will be vectors for disease. And in apples, what'll happen is you'll get a center rot that comes in. It's funny. It's usually some of the best potting soil you'll ever seen is that it'll rot out from the inside, and that soil that comes out is just gold. So if you can, repurpose that for potting or seedlings, it works out really well. But generally with pruning, you've got your Ds, you've got your dead and diseased, you're dying or you're damaged, and you want to make sure to bring that tree back to what's called the branch collar. And so the way the branch collar works, I'm just going to draw this because it's a useful combo. Okay, so if we've got our tree trunk here, and then we've got our branch that comes out, there's usually a bit of a collar for all of our branches, and it's usually a protrudence. It's usually kind of like a donut, or like just a little bit of a muffin top, nothing much. And usually what we want to do with that is we want to cut directly beside but not into that branch collar, and that will help the tree to form its donut coated healing process. You'll see this a lot in good and well pruned trees, is that the branch that's been cut has this donut that comes over it. Problem is if you cut into that branch collar, it's going to create disease and infection and all those other pieces. And if you've never cut before, usually you'll do what's called an undercut, and then you'll do an overcut. So usually what will happen is the branch will rip out here, and it won't actually rip into the full branch collar or into the wood itself. So usually you do an undercut, an overcut, it comes out. And then you can make your clean cut here if you're working with really heavy branches. If you're not, you could just go directly by the branch collar. But for a crab, I would give it compost. I would make sure it's mulched underneath itself. I'd probably put in some companion plants to bring in some more pollinators and potentially some nitrogen fixing shrubs and things of that nature, just so that way you're supporting it. in as many ways as possible. Kind of following the classic guild conversation with a little bit more accessibility. Aerated compost extract upon the soil before you put on the compost can be useful. Compost tea, aerated compost tea on the tree itself after your prune can be super useful. And then, yeah, making sure that if it's 25 years, it already has its water sources figured out. But if it feels like it's struggling because of water, you could also create a soil berm. So these are, a buddy of mine calls these smiley berms, which I like. So basically what it means is that, let's say that this is uphill, up, and this is down. And so basically you would make a little berm, soil berm on the south side. Generally a full swale makes more sense because this takes a lot of time and energy. So basically what this looks like is you've got this berm, and the overflow is dictated by its ability to not inundate the trunk or the crown of the tree. The crown of the tree is where the trunk becomes the roots. So if this water is coming down like so, and water is coming down like so, and it's filling up and it's filling up and it's filling up and it's filling up, you want to make sure that the tips of this swale, smiley swale or net and pan, are lower than the trunk, so that way the trunk never gets inundated with water. But that can be a really easy way to get more water to a tree if it's on slope. If it's flat, of course, this isn't going to work. The other way we've done on flats is we've, and man, do I have a lot of drawings on here now. Let's do a little clear. So if we're working on flats, the other way to do this, that's for water. We're working on flats, and we're working with pre-established trees that are suffering or don't have enough water. Of course, these are brown trees. So if we have trees like this, is we can put hugelcultures kind of at the drip edge again. So we can come back in and we can dig out a section of this, you know, on one side or the other, and then we can fill it with wood. And then that'll decompose and become these little soil reservoirs, put, you know, soil on top, plant it, put in our plantings on that as well. And this has been really successful. If you take a look on my website and look at the Galliano pilot food forest, this was my design conversation for their site, and they get between 3 to 4 months of drought a year, and their trees are still going strong at last count. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm trying to grab a drawing tool and it's not working. Okay, here we go. So basically the tree will eventually find this hugelkultur and it will just devour it. We had a cottonwood that was like 45 feet away from a greenhouse, and we had these big compost piles, and we left them in the winter. We didn't come back to them until the spring. And we went to put a pitchfork in. The pitchfork went in but wouldn't move one way or the other. And the cottonwood had perfectly devoured the compost, and it had a square root ball that was above ground that had like traveled underground, and it had totally filled it out. So, you know, those are some of the ways you might be able to help this crabapple out. Still with us, Courtney? Maybe she left. Oh, there she is. No, she's there.
Technical problem, sorry, but thank you very much. That was illuminating.
Yeah, great. Awesome. Cool. I think I see Collins had to go. Okay, so let's go back to our favorite topic of conversation, AI. So Sergey's conversation here is AI convo follow-up, insightful, if scary at times, interview with Max Tegmark, the case for halting AI development. Max is a physicist and AI researcher at MIT, co-founder of the Future of Life Institute, and author of Life 3.0, Beginning Human in an Age of Artificial Intelligence. Lots of ads in the beginning, can skip. Cool. So what did you want to bring this up about? What did you want to talk about here, sir?
So this is not actually a question. This is more just a follow-up for people who are interested to look into this.
Okay.
But I do have a quick follow-up to that, as I was doing my assignments over the weekend and looking up the plants and what Native Americans used to eat in the summer, fall and stuff. I started experimenting with chat box to get some answers. and I ran into authentication problem, and it would not give me sources, so I kind of like had to find ways to cross-reference these through other resources. So it was incredibly fast and saved a lot of time to just pull up all the different like 6 examples of every like winter spring foods that Native Americans collected in the wild. But authentication is an issue.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the major issues is reliability and truthfulness. And with truthfulness is it showing its sources? And this is where Google Bard was supposedly kind of leapfrogging ChatGPT because it was going to show its sources. Microsoft Edge has a Bing chatbot, which does show its sources, which is quite useful, as does perplexity.ai sometimes. It's still not totally like, I'll show you what I did. A lot of time it's like, this is what I think. So I agree with you. And I think that's what we talked about last time, 2 weeks ago, is that reliability and the truthfulness is problematic. It's currently using itself to check itself, which is problematic. And I'm part of an ethical entrepreneurs AI group. It was one of the first groups I found to be part of, and I've been part of it for a while. And I mentioned to somebody because a person brought up that they got this great email from a marketer and they ran it through Zero GPT, which is supposedly a GPT bot checker. So checking if it came from ChatGPT, and it was 100% true. And there's so many little facets of AI that people don't understand or know. One of them is that it's almost impossible for AI to check itself to know that it's AI. And Zero GPT has shown that the Constitution of the US was written by AI and multiple works of like classic literature. So it can't currently check itself. And my comment to them was, have you ever watched the first scene of, or not the first scene, but the first scene of where Gene Wilder comes out of the Willy Wonka and the chocolate factory, and he looks like he's disabled, and the cane sticks, and he does this big tumbling somersault and jumps up, and everyone's like, oh, he's okay. But the point there, and Gene talks about it in an interview, is that he wanted to make sure that the first interaction with this character was that you didn't know if he's ever telling the truth again. And I think it's a really important part that crosses over into our conversations with AI, because there's a level of, we don't know if it's lying or not, and it currently doesn't know if it's lying or not. And people take issue with the fact that I say lying, but truthful. It's truthful or not, if it's based in reality. And so I agree with you, for ideation and for quickly getting ideas and generally getting the scope of something, fantastic. But then you have to do your due diligence and go see if it's actually true, because it may very well not be. And as we grow AI, there is an equal opportunity. And I see that you've got the Max interview there. Lex Friedman's interview with Eliner was a great one, because it really talks about how it could become more reliable and truthful, or it could not. That's also an equally possible outcome, is that the way it's being trained or the conversations that are coming up, it could become less truthful. And so I'm still using it a ton for like summarizing text and creating quick posts with information that I give it, because it can summarize and create. And I just wrote this big long email about this propagating woody edibles course. And I was like, can you turn this into a quick Facebook post that's like 5 lines long? And it did it. And I had to check it a few times and enter a couple of different pieces and run it through Grammarly and all the rest of it. But as you said, very quick. And I think if we use AI in such a way that it reduces the friction in our work lives, great. But that bigger conversation, which I just saw in one of the newsletters I'm a part of, Dropbox just dropped 16% of its employees for favor of AI, which is the beginning. It's the first big company that's announced that I've seen. And so we're going to see that more and more and more. And I think this is where being conscientious of where and how AI plays a role, but then also being very conscientious of what can we offer as people that's more valuable. And I just got into an argument with a guy because I was posting about the rainwater harvesting course, which Sergey, you're in. And I said, there's never been a better time to have a practical skill. Never. There's never been a better time to have a practical skill, and a skill that people will need people to go and do. He's like, I wouldn't count your chickens about that yet. And he pointed to Boston Dynamics. And it's like, Sure, Boston Dynamics has a couple of robots, but the cost of entry, the cost of training, the cost of all of these things, at least for the next little while, is still going to be too high to do that work. And so I still stand by it. I still say, you know, if you want to start a small scale nursery, if you want to learn how to design rainwater harvesting, if you want to learn how to do gray water or install composting toilets, I still think those are really good skills to have right now.
I agree.
Well, and we haven't even broached, you know, dealing with the economic ramifications of people being put out of work en masse, if, you know, and how society is going to manage that. So.
Yeah, and this is where I think Yuval Harari's work, I don't agree with everything he says, but I don't agree with everybody. It's just every once in a while somebody hits upon a truth. But his conversation is stark, and his conversation, and then Peter Zane, The End of the World is just the beginning, and then Yuval Harari's Homo Deus, and then 21 Problems for the 21st Century. I think they're very on point. I think there's going to be a many humans who in the next 5 to 10 years will not be necessary as people in terms of the economic story that we're telling in the world. And I mean,
I'm a marketer by trade. ChatGPT can do 99% of what I do. Like, and
yeah.
I mean, I hate my job, but like,
yeah,
you know, like it should do what I do, frankly.
Yeah. No, I hear you. I hear you. My dad just started up his renovation business again. And in an hour, I had all of the background material, because one of the best ways to use ChatGPT is to tell it to ask you enough questions so it's smart enough to then answer. And so if you're using that sort of master prompt, I basically said, there's a brand new business. I want a full marketing spec and package in terms of descriptions, conversations, potentially, you know, large scale values, brand kit. Ask me as many questions as you need to understand this. And so like I had a call with him at 11. At 10:30, I started prompting it. And it had the bio, the mission statement, the values, you know, it just had it all in terms of a word conversation. And then I started asking it, what would you see as being a strong logo for this? What would you see as being a strong cover for Facebook? Like all of these pieces. And then you pop over to Canva, and then you basically just do as your AI overlord tells you. Because I want to help my dad out. He's been having a bit of a rough go. So, you know, I put this all together in a short amount of time to help him out, because I can do it, because I understand what the program could do. But like I looked at that and I'm like, marketer, probably be like $1,000 to $2,000 to give that package, to have that color palette, to have, you know, it's insane how quickly it's
like a full brand identity. Yeah, you can pay. I mean, depending on who it is, like.
Right. Like brand identities could start at $2,000 and go to $200,000. Like it's quite involved. So it's really fascinating to see how quickly it's taking white collar. And I think if we're not conscientious about using it and working with it, then there's problems. But then there's the lethality aspect, which is, it's very possible and it's very probable that if it gains sentience, or if it has a value set that's at odds with having people on the planet, which is this Eliza podcast that Friedman had with him, then the easiest course of action for a computer that doesn't necessarily have innate values is to go, well, then the world shouldn't have people in it. And it'll find the quickest way to do that. And that's not, like, the way he's speaking about it is a lack of human compassion, which is the scariest part, because that's the way computers work, right? They're logic machines.
One of the examples was that AI can determine that oxygen is corrosive and prevents expansion of computing power. So you just need to kill the oxygen, not the humans, you know, just the oxygen.
Yeah, and there's just a small byproduct, which is all life on the planet ceases to be. Yeah, the number of lethalities, and that's what I like about the heck is his blog? Oh, Wrong Less Often is his blog. But the thought experiments and the conversations, and I think this is why Elon Musk and others are calling for a halt or regulation on something that could if it goes wrong once, it could go wrong in a way that ends the species. I think that's the important part here, is that the lethality could be complete in a short amount of time. And that's problematic for life on the planet.
It goes back to that quote from Jurassic Park, right? Jeff Goldblum says science was so concerned about whether or not they could, they didn't stop to think if they should.
100%. And Patton Oswalt, comedian, put back onto that science. Too much should, or too much coulda, not enough shoulda. You know, can we do it? Yes. Should we do it? No. And I think this is where, like, the Hadron Collider, Oppenheimer, and the nuclear bomb, there was a percentage of possibility theoretically that he could ignite all the oxygen in the atmosphere with Oppenheimer. And then with the Hadron Collider, there was an opportunity that the cascading of the atoms that they were firing together could cascade and fire every atom. You know, there's these huge possibilities, but it doesn't stop humans. And so I don't see us stopping AI. I don't see us stopping the development. I don't see us stopping the exploration of it. And if we do end up halting, let's say, US AI or stopping OpenAI, that's not panlateral across the world and a bunch of people stopping as well. It's like, at this point, with things like AutoGPT and what's being produced there, and then I don't know if you guys follow any of the newsletters, but every week there's at least 30 to 50 new companies that popped up that weren't there before. That won't stop that base conversation, and it'll just push people to another vendor who has an LLM or what the next AI agent is. So yeah, big questions. It kind of feels like we're in our own nuclear age where it's so big. It's so much bigger than us, then you can't really even be worried about it, because you can't, like, those of us that are aware of it can't do anything about it. Like, there's nothing that, you know, we can do besides understand it, understand its value, understand its lethality, and hopefully that spurs us into different action. Like, well, if that's the case, then back to the garden, let's keep tending the carrots, because they still need to grow.
Right.
Mhm.
Right. Well, isn't BlackRock the everything giant? Mostly, a lot of its decisions are farmed out to its proprietary AI, as far as I understand it.
Yeah.
So
I would be surprised.
that's terrifying.
I wouldn't be surprised. I read enough science fiction. I wouldn't be surprised. You know, like,
Yeah.
if you have something that can take gigaquads of data points, like just an amazing amount of data points, and come up with what it says is a solution. And this is funny, because this is me going back to what I talked about at the beginning, which is having a system makes the brain rest easy. It's very easy to give your design process, your decision-making process, to another, because you think it's good for you, and it will just continue to be good for you. And we all, like, I talked about it for me. I don't think at this point I'm going to give my life path or conversation to an AI, or go to like a Black Mirror conversation where, you know, the moment you're born, your genome is sequenced and it'll tell you what to do and how to do it, and, you know, go into that process. I'm sure we'll get there at some point. Probably not in my lifetime, but yeah, there's definitely companies and conversations that are running that. And I would say, now that I've taken a look at ChatGPT and I've seen what it can produce, I would say the majority of a lot of the stories I've seen or watched on television over the last couple of years were AI influenced, because some of the generic nature of what I'm seeing, I just, my mind boggled to think that it was made by committee. It's like, we really got something that bland by committee, or was it just farmed out to an LLM? So
Yeah.
I don't know.
All right, thank you. I need to
Thanks.
go back to my bobcat.
Back to Bobcat. I'll go back to planting, and we'll see each other in 2 weeks. Take care, everybody.
Ciao.
Bye.